Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us on this Giving Tuesday for what Tamar and I were just referring to as live from the archives, the triumphant return. After 2 years, we have now returned with this brand new program where we're going to talk about the AJHS collections and how our early collections document some of the earliest philanthropic and mutual aid societies within the Jewish community here in America. And I'm joined by my able colleague,
Tamar Zefrin, Director of Archival Partnerships, and we're again really thrilled that you are choosing to spend part of your Giving Tuesday with us. AJHS, we were founded in 1892. We actually just recently celebrated our 130th anniversary as of June 7th. I think we look great for our age. We are the oldest extant cultural and ethnic archive in the United States, and our mandate, or rather a facet of our mandate that is relevant to our discussion today, is to preserve, steward, and provide access to the documentary record of the history and impact and presence of Jews in the Americas from 1654 to the present, and as well to serve as a national and international resource for scholarship through digital access of our catalogs, public programs like this one, and exhibitions. Within our holdings, we steward more than 30 million documents, 50,000 books, over 100,000 images, art and artifacts, and audiovisual objects. And among the countless treasures that we hold are a handwritten notebook of Emma Lazarus's The New Colossus, originally published in 1883, which now graces the base of the Statue of Liberty, some of Hank Greenberg's bats, the archive of the American Soviet Jewry movement, and compelling collections across the fields of education, science, sports, business, the arts, and philanthropy, which brings us to our topic for this afternoon's program.
That is correct. Next slide. So before, though, we talk about some of these early philanthropy collections, Tamar and I thought it would be helpful to give an overview of how a lot of these organizations came to be and what sort of that landscape, the American Jewish landscape, was in this point in time. So, catalyst for Jewish communities that were forming outside the Northeast, because as people are immigrating in frequently through the Northeast, they're then moving into the Midwest as well as the West Coast, as well as the South, and establishing new Jewish communities outside of the Northeast. So then, this is we're talking at that point, those statistics, the early 19th century. And by the way, those statistics, I believe, came from Hasia Diner's book, for those who may want to look it up themselves. But then as we get into the late 19th century, we see a shift. What we see is a large wave of Eastern European Jewish immigrants that lands in America. And they are from Russia, from points farther east than Germany. And the desire to immigrate from these locales is driven by two factors. One, which is virtually the same as the German immigrants that came before, which is a real total lack of any meaningful economic opportunities for Jewish citizens that are living in these areas. But particularly in the case of Jews in Russia, the increasing violence that is directed at Jewish communities, specifically the pogroms that terrorized the Jewish occupants of Eastern Europe. And these pogroms escalated, particularly following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, as the Jewish community was blamed for this act. And so what happens is, from these two waves of immigration, what we start seeing is the establishment of benevolent mutual aid, relief, and later on philanthropic organizations that were formed by these immigrants to assist the existing Jewish communities, but also these new immigrants. And Tamar is now going to discuss the establishment of the benevolent societies.
Thank you. As Melanie has framed for us, these benevolent societies really at home in America are growing out of a increased concern and awareness of Jews in America about what is happening to Jews abroad, Jews overseas. And this is really reflected in, as our records indicate, is reflected in the similar names appearing over and over in the founding and administration of these benevolent societies. Those names are always drawn from those whose families had immigrated in earlier decades, even centuries ago, and who had already established themselves in business and in civic society. So what is distilled here and is captured really in the records is this is an indication of, once there an awareness of what to do once one has acquired some stability and, in this case, some material resources.
Mhm.
Next slide, please. And as Melanie already introduced, these philanthropic and communal entities not only existed to assist new and incoming immigrants, though of course that was a primary preoccupation, but as well to sustain support and resources for those who were not fortunate enough to be able to emigrate to these shores. Of course, those who were able to emigrate here suffered tremendous hardship as well, but there had to remain this dual focus for philanthropic societies that were based here. The fates of Jewish communities in Russia and elsewhere, especially the pogroms and other expressions of anti-Semitic violence, remained a tremendous and abiding concern for American Jews, and this is reflected in these philanthropic records. What's particularly notable, as you're probably noticing a theme here, is that these concerns are outward focused. It is Jews in America concerned about Jews abroad. Many of our earliest collections from the late 19th and early 20th century that focus on philanthropy are focusing on infrastructure set up locally, collections taking place locally, but the resources being distributed abroad. But one, and actually with the next slide, one interesting focus is, although the spotlight remains on communities abroad, it's clear from the correspondence and records in these collections, slide please, that many of these philanthropic agencies are aware of manifestations of those same virulent ideologies like xenophobia, like anti-Semitism, manifesting themselves right here in America. This illustration is from an American periodical called The Judge, and it reads, "Our peaceful rural districts, as they are liable to be infested if this Russian exodus of the persecuted Hebrew continues much longer." So, and that's of course the tip of the iceberg in terms of the documentary record of how persecuted emigrating Jews were perceived. And so there's awareness in the philanthropic collections of the need to be a buffer on two fronts, both activist measures abroad and advocacy measures at home.
Yeah, that is absolutely true, because what you're seeing, as Tamar stated, is, so the Jews in America are really concerned on two fronts. They're deeply concerned about what's happening in Russia. And I might add, this is a concern that goes from some of the top, most affluent American Jewish citizens at that point who are taking fact-finding journeys to Russia. This is also documented in our, in these records as well. But then they're also concerned about what's happening at home, because then they're very concerned that these new Russian immigrants, these new Russian Jewish immigrants, are also being met by anti-Semitism here. And so you're seeing these mutual aid and relief societies and philanthropic societies organizing really around these two main, I feel like, central tenets to a certain degree. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so AJHS has been collecting records of these types of philanthropies, large and small, ranging from collections that are literally one folder to ones that are 2,200 feet, okay, as we currently have. And while our earliest accessions, which library and archives speak for the things we take in, were largely book focused, because the earliest days of the society were focused on the building of the library, as well as encouraging scholarship from these items. The top 5 collections that, or I should say 5 of the earliest collections that we had here are all early philanthropic organizations. So we have the National National Committee for the Relief of Sufferers of Russian Massacres. We have the Solomon Society records, tongue twister there. We have the People's Relief Committee for Jewish War Sufferers, which we're going to talk a bit more about later in this lecture, which is an absolutely fascinating collection. We have the North American Relief Society for the indigent Jews in Jerusalem and Palestine. And we also have the Central Committee of America in aid of starving Jews in South Russia. So you can see 4 out of these 5 are entirely focused on Jewish citizens who are not living in the United States. But it's also important to note that, roughly speaking, around the period we're talking about, 3/4 of the world's Jewish population either lived in Europe or in the Middle East. Okay, so that's why the focus of a lot of these early collections is on what is happening in Europe, particularly when you're when you're looking at the pogroms right into World War I, This is a very tumultuous period, an enormous amount of displacement, but they're also deeply concerned, obviously, about the plight of indigent Jews in the Middle East as well. So the one collection out of these 5 that is not outwardly focused is Solomon Society. I'm going to try and shorten it so I don't twist it up again, which is an example of a community, a very local and community-focused philanthropic enterprise in that Mr. Solomon was a German immigrant, self-made, did very, very well here in real estate, and decided then to start giving his money away. And one of his major beneficiaries was that of the Hebrew Orphan Asylum, which is another communal organization that helped take care of Jewish children who were lacking 1 or 2 parents or who were otherwise in desperate straits. And so what Mr. Solomon did is he funded essentially sort of bequests to people who were the alumni of the Hebrew Orphan Asylum to help them, essentially what we would now call once they aged out. And so he was trying to assist those who were aging out to give them a leg up, to be successful citizens. But it's very interesting anyway to note that out of this 5, out of these very early ones, almost all of this concern, a great deal of it, is really focused outward to Europe and to what's happening here. Obviously, there's also a great deal, as we said, physical displacement, a great deal of physical violence. And so the Jewish population of America is obviously deeply concerned with what is then happening overseas. And actually leave this slide up. So this is a great one. So now we're going to show you some images from the collections because that's the fun stuff.
That's what we're all about.
That's what we're all about. That's the fun stuff. So
so what you're seeing on your screen is a ledger, in fact, from another tongue twister, North American Relief Society for Indigent Jews from Jerusalem and Palestine.
yes.
And this, next slide, please. This, along with this receipt book for the Central Committee of America in Aid of Starving Jews in Russia. You can see here that, even given the relatively small scope of these philanthropic entities, there is a very formal, almost elaborate mechanism, not just of documenting and providing receipts for the individuals who are donating. Remember, the American Jewish communities who are supporting these organizations to send funds abroad are themselves often eking out, hard scrabble existences. And so the sums that they are donating, and this will be touched upon a bit later in the, as Melanie has indicated, Fascinating People's Relief Collection Records Committee, it's not only a way, of course, to document and to be held accountable for the transmission of funds, but it's also a way of inculcating this sense of civic and mutual responsibility, and giving the donors an emblem of pride to be able to indicate, to share, to hopefully engage others in this event, literal life-saving donation work. Next slide, please. And as always in the archives, when you least expect it, you'll come across a particular gem. This is actually indicating a different part of the correspondence. So moving from the ledger and the receipt book, this is a letter dated in November 1905 to someone from I'll refer back to I think it's the Committee for Victims of Russian for the Relief of Victims of Russian Massacres.
Yes.
And this is a letter which supposedly is accompanying a donation. The donation itself did not survive the vagaries of time, but we have the letter in AJHS's holdings, and it is from Elihu Root, who, as of the writing of this letter in November 1905, had a few months ago assumed the position of Secretary of State in President Teddy Roosevelt's cabinet.
Yeah.
This was also about 7 years prior to his winning the Nobel Peace Prize for efforts in other theaters, and it's a remarkable indication of the growing and abiding scope of these philanthropic organizations. Obviously, it's no surprise that a lot of the artifacts and images that we have shown are, seem to be drawn from more local realms, based in New York or its environs. But here there is a very high-ranking, notable politician, lawyer, served as Attorney General at one juncture.
That's right.
Who is responding to a plea from one such organization and is writing an accompanying letter expressing his heartfelt support and sympathy for the cause.
Yes. Can you have the next slide, please? So now we're going to talk about one of my absolute favorite collections, the People's Relief Committee, I-13. This collection was actually originally donated to the New York Public Library and then was accessioned by the AJHS by the chief librarian at NYPL in the early 1930s because it was felt that it would belong here. So the PRC, as we call it, which is the People's Relief Committee for Jewish War Sufferers, was established in 1915. And what's interesting about it is, so it was essentially made up to solicit donations from secular Yiddish-speaking Jews, mainly from labor and socialist group, lodges, trade unions, workmen's circle, etc., because a lot of the relief at that point was being funneled through religious organizations. So basically, this was created to tap an entirely different donor pool. And essentially, they build themselves almost as like a socialist philanthropy. There was built into it this distrust of big philanthropy, because the JDC was also around at this point in time, was also collecting funds and distributing to the same causes. But the PRC was interesting because they were almost exclusively appealing to small dollar donors, literally going sometimes door to door on the Lower East Side. Even if you only gave a penny, you got a handwritten receipt, as we were discussing. The validation, I think, is also very important, because a lot of these people as well that are giving are new immigrants themselves, may only be a few years or a few decades away from their own immigrant groups. And I think it shows the pride also that people felt, the idea that even though they didn't have a lot, they had something that they could give to those in need back in the countries that they often came from themselves. And so again, a nickel, a penny, everybody got a printed receipt. Post-World War I, the PRC basically eventually ceased operations in 1924. I believe a few years prior, at that point in time, it was decided that only European organizations were going to distribute relief. So then the JDC, various places that were all collecting funds for this sort of communal purposes, all then redirected these funds to different activities, either different relief efforts in different geographic areas or here within the United States. But the PRC was also helping to facilitate, I believe, a limited amount of immigration for those displaced in the aftermath of World War I, as well as helping to place orphans, children who sadly were orphaned via World War I. But then also what you see in 1924 are even more restrictive immigration quotas on Jewish immigration. So at that point, the PRC decided essentially to cease their operations. So this is an organization that was only in existence for 9 years, but those records were viewed even then important enough that they were donated to the New York Public Library, that this was something that was absolutely worth preserving. So it's an absolutely wonderful collection that documents the donors, as well as there's an enormous amount of correspondence between the PRC and various offices in Europe, how the aid is going to be distributed, where it's going to go. But the really interesting thing, or I should say, sort of frustrating thing about this collection over the years, is that it's a bit of a victim of its time in terms of the actual condition of the collection. I'm going to spare everyone my incredibly long and boring lecture about paper-making practices, but suffice it to say, it is boring, but suffice it to say, late 19th and early 20th century paper is of generally poor quality, especially, and so it degrades much faster. When you hear people talking about acid paper or you see yellowed newsprint, that's what we're talking about. And the entire collection was printed on this absolutely terrible quality paper. And then, if you can advance to the next slide, all of this correspondence was then bound into volumes that were held together with strips of wood and rusty nails. So all of these incredibly important volumes have been in a slow slide of decay over really the last 100 years or so. It's been almost 100 years since the PRC ceased existence. And so we had to severely limit and then fully restrict access to this collection for a very long time, simply because number one, it was unsafe to use. I don't generally restrict things lightly, but something where I might worry that a reader would need a tetanus shot after handling it, I think is fair game for restriction. And quite frankly, also, even the ones that were not bound with the rusty nails, the paper was in such poor quality that even the most incredibly diligent use of it, following every rule, we were just losing enormous amounts of paper, and we were in danger, in fact, of losing substantial blocks of text. So we really had no choice but to restrict it. But then, thanks to the largesse, and we are very grateful of this, of the National Endowment for the Humanities, in the year 2021, we were awarded a 2-year grant to completely digitize and preserve this collection in its entirety. So if you look at the finding aid now, it says it's permanently closed and restricted, but wait till July of 2023, and then the entire collection will be available digitally so that you can look at it from anywhere. You don't have to come to the reading room. Unfortunately, the originals will have to stay closed because while we have managed to ameliorate the danger to readers, the paper itself is still suffering from that poor quality. But being able to provide access to this entire collection digitally was a huge priority for me as soon as I started here at AJHS, and I'm really so pleased that we're able to do this. And this grant is being done in collaboration with our colleagues at the Center for Jewish History, who are assisting us with preservation and digitization of this incredibly important collection. You want to move to the next slide?
Thank you.
Yes.
And as you've heard, the People's Relief Committee, those records have a tremendous amount to recommend them on many fronts. And in the course of our brief overview of philanthropic collections, they stand out as a useful bridge because we begin to see a transition from some of the earlier, more perhaps limited in scope philanthropic entities, mutual aid societies, into something like the People's Relief Committee, which not only is expanding fundraising and distribution avenues, but also branches out, in fact, into immigration support and advocacy, which is a different host of skills and an expansion of the definition of mutual aid and philanthropic responsibility. And so really you can view these holdings as beads on a necklace, in a sense, where it is reflecting at different periods in time the evolution and the ability of different organizations to respond to what they perceive as the most pressing needs of the time. Absolutely. And very briefly, federations, a term which in itself summons up the image of many different entities, you know, subsumed into one or working as one. AJHS holds the United Jewish Appeal, or UJA collection, which in itself provides a rare glimpse into the transformation of a complex, to say the least, philanthropic entity, again, through almost a century. Hopefully everyone is able to see on their screen the 5 agencies whose earlier records are contained within this collection. So I won't read them out here, but I want to stress that this collection is invaluable for researchers on many fronts. But one particular thing that stands out in the context of today's discussion is that it affords us a longitudinal glimpse into the eventual fate, given the expansion, both in scope and visibility, of Jewish communities across the United States. It gives a glimpse into the fate of what becomes of these smaller entities, the individuals, the personalities who spearheaded them, and of course, what they perceived as their philanthropic values. Where do those fall out? What survives, what endures under different, in different fundraising campaigns? Next slide, please. And how does that continue to serve as a lens onto the political and civic preoccupations of the time? This is just one of the many fantastic posters and other visual media in the UJA collection. This poster reads, "Will you sentence them to death, or shall they live?" This is an illustration for the United Jewish Campaign of New York. And we believe that it's in the, like many wonderful challenges in the archives, this poster is not dated. So we are relying on context clues from the language, the iconography, and other details, but is looking to raise $6 million. And it has the overall figure of the judge and the jury at the top, and then what could be understood in the common parlance to be teeming masses of persecuted European Jews hoping to emigrate, situated at the bottom. And this is just one, again, of the many examples of how language and visual aids and communal and civic engagement are all harnessed in service of what the American Jewish community has identified as philanthropic goals for over a century.
Because it's very dramatic too, so the judge and the jury, and it's the imagery they're using, like you said, it's extremely dramatic.
Very
and it's
stark.
Meant to get a reaction, meant to get you to open your pocketbook, literally. Oh, and then this is me. Okay, so where do we go from here? So we've discussed some of the earliest ones. We've also discussed very briefly UJA-Federation and its importance. And so over time, we've been collecting these types of collections steadily, really over, I would say about the last 100 to 115 years, thereabouts. UJA-Federation obviously is a very big one, a more recent one within the last decade. That is the largest AJHS collection. It is 2,200 linear feet. So if you can imagine 2,200 giant boxes full of many reams of paper, That's what we're talking about. It is an absolute gold mine of information about its current structure and how they got there. And as Tamar said, all of those successor agencies that combined in various incarnations and then eventually combined in the mid-80s to become what is now UJA-Federation. We also have the collection of the National Jewish Welfare Board, which is divided into various component parts, which were donated at different times based on also their different activities over their many years. That is the second largest collection. I would say, as a ballpark, if you put them all together, it's roughly 1,800 linear feet, a great deal of which documents NJWB's efforts during the war, during the various wars, to document the participation of Jewish soldiers and sailors, but to also make sure that Jewish chaplains are in the field, providing prayer books for Jewish GIs, an entire wealth of activities. But then after World War II, they had to shift focus, as we were talking about. Many of these, some of these smaller societies, essentially the problem that they're looking to address is either addressed in some way or another. A war ends, other organizations take over, or they shift their focus. And we see this a great deal, and especially with something that was so big as NJWB, that really had so much infrastructure, they shifted modes. And they said, we're gonna focus now domestically and work on activities here in the United States. We also have some of the newer ones, the Avi Hai Foundation, which was completed, processing was completed in late 2020. And we are just about to wrap up two very exciting collections in the field of philanthropy, that of the Bronfman Foundation, as well as the Bronfman Fellowship Program. And those are literally in the 11th hour of processing as we speak. And this is just a few. This is literally just a small sample of the two biggest ones and a few of the most recent ones. But there's much more to mine here, as well as we also have the individual papers of many of the people who have worked at these organizations or who have contributed personally to various philanthropic endeavors as well. Next slide, please. So you might ask, how do we find these things? All of AJHS's archival collections and books are cataloged for the most part. So you visit our single search portal, which is search.cjh.org, and you enter in the collections. All of our available collection materials, library and archives, are available through this portal. Archives have what is called a finding aid, which is, I make the equivalent, like a book has a table of contents, an archive has a finding aid, although it's not an exact one-to-one match, it's close enough. It tells you the general themes, topics, what is contained. And if you're looking at a finding aid and materials are digitized and available, you'll see a red icon that reads, view this folder. And when you click on the folder, so in July, when the People's Relief Committee is fully available, you will click on that folder and you will be able to page through all of the materials in the order that they are in the archival collection. So we're essentially replicating the experience of being in the reading room and going through these things physically in the digital environment. So when you click on that icon, you'll be directed to the digital form. But if you have questions about accessing these things, or better yet, if you want to come here and use the collections in person, our reading room is open 4 days a week, staffed with wonderful reference librarians. So please contact them at inquiries.cjh.org with any questions about on-site usage, making appointments, availability of materials, etc. And of course, I strongly encourage everyone who can make it to come and view collections in person, because digitization is wonderful, but I'm of the opinion there's nothing really like actually going through the boxes. It is an incredibly enjoyable experience. Next slide. So then a collateral, I suppose a related question, right? So who uses these records? Who uses the records of philanthropies? And this is something that we have talked about a great deal as we have been talking about giving this talk, and also just the philanthropy holdings in general. And what I think is very interesting is that a lot of the focus has shifted, I feel like. So family historians and genealogists have long used these kind of records to track down ancestors, because ledgers and financial records, these can be used to fill in vital records about your family, whether they're being listed as a donor or listed as a beneficiary, but that's frequently where the focus was. And a great deal of the focus, in fact, was on the beneficiaries. who is receiving the monies, who are the individuals, what are the charities, who are the people involved. And this has been a focus for a lot of these records for a long time. That's led to some great indexing projects as well, to be able to fill in some of these gaps. But what we have seen, especially with a lot of the large collections, with National Jewish Welfare Board, with UJA, we see a shift of focus, right? And people are still very interested in the beneficiaries. Everyone wants to know where the money goes and who gets it. But now we see a lot more historians and people looking at the complex operational analyses of how these organizations function. And if you're looking at organizations where we have decades of records, you're also seeing shifts in priorities, sometimes from decade to decade, but sometimes from year to year. How do foundations decide what to fund? How do they set their priorities for every year? And again, how do these things change with the changing landscape of America? I mean, the Bronfman Fellowship records are actually really interesting window into that, because when you look at things like the essays or how applicants are chosen, you know, the students have to talk about their Jewish identity. And this changes literally from decade to decade as you're thinking about big watershed events that have happened in the United States, and how this informs how people look at their culture, at their religion, and what their place is in this. So it's really interesting and gratifying, I feel like, to see that we're seeing these records used in a much more different and sort of holistic way, as opposed to a real focus solely on the beneficiary. So I think that's really interesting. We love to look at how records are used, because it also allows us to better serve you, the user, when we know what people are looking for and looking at. So next slide.
Thank you for offering me a perfect segue. As well, I could have asked for a better introduction. As well, you know, just to underscore and amplify what Melanie has said, it's not only that we want to be able to serve research needs now, but archives, despite popular misconception, is actually always looking towards the future, because we are always actively looking to identify, to survey, and to collect what is the record of what is happening in the present, so that will inform future research about the press. And the only way to do that is indeed to be looking through the lens of current AJHS holdings on any topic, in this case, of course, on philanthropy, and through our connections with donors of those collections, as well as those who are conducting research on them, to be able to understand and pinpoint where are the current day equivalent of the People's Relief Committee. Where are those activities taking place now? What are the needs that are being addressed? How are they being identified? Who has agency, even in, you know, as both the donor and a beneficiary? So these are questions off the top of our heads that preoccupy us as staff here at AJHS, with our mandate to preserve, steward, and provide access to the ongoing history and impact of American Jewish philanthropy. But there will always be more, you know, questions. It'll always be outstripping our ability to capture that. But that's why we engage in so many of these discussions, because it really is a reciprocal and communal effort to capture this enduring communal function. And so these, in service of this goal, AJHS is always seeking new opportunities, new partnerships to enable our users, present and future, to access and to interpret these records for research via digitization, indexing, as Melanie already mentioned, public programs like this one, and who knows, new resources and ways of conveying information that we're not yet aware of, but we're looking forward to you joining us on that journey together.
Absolutely. And to just sort of bookend also what Tamar was saying about these new opportunities, you know, libraries and archives apply for a fair amount of grants from various places. And currently AJHS is in partnership on 3 major grants funded by the NEH, the IML, actually 2 by NEH and 1 by the IMLS, that allow us to digitize the People's Relief Committee, but we are also digitizing the entirety of the Baron de Hirsch Fund, which is another very, very important philanthropic organization, also founded in the late 19th century to assist the Jewish community here in America, but also worldwide. This is an incredibly important collection that, very much like the PRC, is also suffering from extremely poor paper quality. It's you pick it up and just little bits fall off and it breaks your heart. So the entire collection is going to be digitized. But what is even more exciting is that in about a month, I guess, we are about to start a brand new grant to process for the first time an extremely large philanthropic collection that AJHS has had for a considerable period of time, which is the Council of Jewish Federations and Welfare Funds. So another very large collection documenting federations, but this one is a national federation structure, which will also allow us, and this is what I'm very excited about, to look at what some of these federations in places outside of New York are doing. What are some of these federation affiliates doing in the Midwest, in the South, in the West? I think what we wrote is that this would provide the connective tissue for a lot of, for some of this study to really fill in the blanks, because we tend to be a lot of times New York focused, not by design, but sometimes by default, because many of the philanthropies and mutual aid societies who we've collected were physically located here. But we're very excited to be able to do that. And we are always looking for these new opportunities to provide more access to the physical materials, whether it's by processing a collection and making it available in the reading room, or by really expanding that footprint and making these things accessible via digitization, which clearly just opens up access to entirely new pools of users. And it is really our goal here to get as much material into the hands of as many people as we possibly can in terms of the AJHS records, because they're truly a treasure.
That's our giving to you.
That's our giving to you, exactly. So thank you for joining us on this Giving Tuesday. Should you want to support any of the wonderful, if I do say so, work that we are doing here at the AJHS, you can go to ajhs.org, donate. But we would also, before we close out, we would like to see if there are any questions that have been asked.
All right, Jane Strom would like to know, where does the joint distribution figure in here?
It's a great question, Jane. Certainly. So, as we said at the outset, this is even a teaser, one could say, a teaser through the whole host of philanthropic collections. It was certainly a subject that has been written about many times, and as well, deserving of a more extended focus. JDC's archives are, in what is an unusual situation, are currently actively maintained in-house. And so the documentary record of JDC's activities from its founding in 1914 to the present are best captured in their own institutional archives. And so I would recommend visiting their archives website to learn more about where that fits in, as you've put it, in this sector. I will say that, as Melanie alluded to earlier, the People's Relief Committee is one of the founding constituent agencies that eventually was subsumed into what became the Joint Distribution Committee. And so, of course, there is correspondence that has traces both in JDC's archives and in AJHS's archives of prominent individuals who were involved in certainly in creating and administering the PRC, and as well as deciding about the fate of those operations, which is very much the case with archives in general. Archives, you often need multiple archives to cover many different sides of this enduring historical conversation.
And also the JDC, given its longevity, given the enormous size of its operations, you can probably find materials about the JDC in every Jewish archive and historical society across America. We have some here because their annual reports, the reports of their activities, these were things that were of great interest to both the people that donated them, but I would also say just to the American Jewish community at large. So the JDC, but yes, they maintain their own extremely large, if I'm correct, yes, archive. They maintain it in-house. So did we have any other questions?
We have one more from a Sarah W.
Okay.
What is the difference between philanthropy and mutual aid?
Okay, this is something we were just discussing today, because as we look across these collections and you look at the titles of the collections, the names of the organizations, because what we basically talked about today are some mutual aid societies, some relief societies, and some philanthropies. And so where are those lines? And what we would say, what underpins them all is this fundamental commitment to marshaling resources, collecting resources, and distributing them out to those in need. I really feel like the big difference is when people think of something like philanthropy, you're thinking of, say, like if you put philanthropy into Google, what a lot of times you'll get are philanthropists. It'll show you Mike Bloomberg, it'll show you Mackenzie Scott, it will show you So a lot of times I feel philanthropy has sort of an association with an individual who is disposing of their largesse, but is also frequently driving the funding priorities. Like when Andrew Carnegie decided he was going to build community libraries all across America, that was something that he felt deeply about as a basically self-made man, and felt that it was important for America, for every place to have a public library so that everyone could essentially better themselves and, you know, move up the ladder as he did. But whereas mutual aid and sort of benevolent societies are frequently organized, I think, within a community, and often then the community is setting the priorities. So like Landsmannschaften organizations, of which AJHS does not have a great deal of those collections. Those are primarily held by the YIVO Institute, our wonderful partners that are here in the same building. And those, for example, were largely organized based on the town that people immigrated from. So it would be the Bialy style, whatever, you know, name your town, benevolent society, sometimes multiple ones from various towns as well. So I would say the difference, it's a subtle difference, I feel, because really the goal is similar. It's we're going to collect resources. We've identified a need, or we've identified something, a need that needs to be met. And then we're going to marshal these resources and then distribute them out. I think that's.
And like many terms, I mean, like all terms, right? They evolve. A term like philanthropy or mutual aid, sometimes it's, you know, it derives its power, its meaning from the context. So if you were to, if you are, and we welcome you to come look at the records from these early collections, they, you know, the correspondents themselves refer to it as aid, they refer to it as humanitarian aid, they refer to, you know, philanthropy has a certain valence for those of us researching and preserving these materials today, and those of you watching this webinar with us. But, you know, that term has evolved throughout time, which is another reason that it's so important to maintain access to these collections, because there will always, it gives us the ability to mine, as Melanie said, for new historic understandings of what are the differences, if at all, between these terms.
Is there, looks like someone raised their hand.
We do
No
have
more questions?
3 more questions.
Okay, we can probably take, well, why don't you give us one, and then we'll see what we're doing on time.
Great. Okay. One person is looking to find out if one of these societies sent money to his family in Russia. So how would he use our sources, our philanthropic collection sources, to figure this out?
I would look at the finding aids for the collections to see what is contained in them, because some of these things are literally a century old, and as with even new archives, sometimes the documentation is patchy, I guess would be the word. So some of the collections have detailed accounts of who beneficiaries are, or a lot of times what organizations in Europe they were distributing money to, and then you could then find those records and sort of, you know, piece it together from there. Other ones concentrate on donors or correspondence about, again, how money's being distributed, who's distributing it, that kind of thing. But so I would recommend looking at some of the ones we mentioned earlier, looking at the finding aids for those. Sadly, I don't think any of those are available digitally now, but there's been interest in these, and I think we're going to prioritize some of these smaller ones for digitization in the coming year. So stay tuned. If you can't get here in person, we are diligently working on making these records more widely accessible to everyone.
And just to reiterate, how would you begin that search? You would go to search.cjh.org and right at the very top of the screen, an accessible search bar, begin by, in this case, maybe typing in, you know, the name of a town, as Melanie said, or your family's name, and it will, you know, it really is, it is a treasure trail. And so, you know, even if you start with one term and that doesn't quite yield a result, there are multiple resources and guides on the Center for Jewish History website, and down the AJHS website that will hopefully be able to help you narrow your search and identify what you're looking for.
It may also be helpful to reach out to the Genealogy Institute here at CJH. We are AJHS, so we know what's in our records, but there's 4 other partners in this building that also collect records of similar and different types. And sometimes the genealogy people can be really, really good at helping you focus your search and think about what other records, both in this building and out of it, might be helpful to you in that search. So, all right, we have time for one more question. If there is one, is there one more, or did we cover?
we covered just about everything.
Wonderful.
There are some specific inquiries that I encourage you all to email to info@ajhs.org.
And we would like to thank everybody again who tuned in for this on this Giving Tuesday. And we'd also really like to thank everyone who consistently donates today and other days to support the mission of this organization. We could not do it without you. And we really, really thank you from the bottom of our heart for your support. So thank you for tuning in, and please visit our website, www.ajhs.org, to learn more about our mission, our collections, and also how to contact us.
We hope to see you again soon, either virtually or on site.
Yes.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much. Have a good
Take care.
afternoon.
Bye.